Everyone, my name is Tanya Misselt. I'm the director of the River Falls Public Library. Thank you for coming to our virtual program tonight. We have this program going live through our Facebook Live page and also recorded on, it will be recorded later. It's also on YouTube. So people can watch it live, they can watch it recorded later. We'll have a question and answer session with the author after her presentation. Feel free to submit questions while the presentation is going on, and we'll just ask them at the end. So this month, we are celebrating Women's History Month in this March, and I wanted to find a book a few months ago that was fitting for some of the current things in the news with reproductive rights. This is kind of fits in there, but more about eugenics. So the book is The Unfit Heiress, The Tragic and Scandalous Sterilization of Anne Cooper Hewitt, and it's by Audrey Clare Farley. Audrey Clare Farley is a scholar of 20th century American culture and with a special interest in science and religion. She earned a PhD in English literature from the University of Maryland, College Park, and now teaches in the history department at Mount St. Mary's University. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New Republic, and many other outlets. She lives in Hanover, Pennsylvania. Please welcome Audrey Clare Farley.
Thank you so much, Tanya. It's really an honor to be here and to be hosted for this, especially at a time when libraries are under siege. I totally support public libraries, and I'm really honored to be able to share this story of Anne Cooper Hewitt and to support your public library. So I will begin here by introducing Anne Cooper Hewitt, who is the subject of my first book. I'll talk about her life, the questions I raised in my biography, the broader eugenics movement, and then, if time permits, pivot to my second book, which is out in June. In many ways, that book is a sequel to The Unfit Heiress insofar as it picks up on a lot of the same inquiries. It's a totally different story about different people from a different time and place, but audience members will surely be able to note some common themes. I want to also begin by crediting Wendy Klein, who introduced me to Anne Cooper Hewitt. She is a historian and academic who wrote a book in 2001 called Building a Better Race, which contained a chapter on Anne Cooper Hewitt. And my book builds on her insights, and it really wouldn't exist without Klein. So thank you to her. Anne Cooper Hewitt was a wealthy heiress, born in 1914, actually the day that World War I broke out. Her mother made a point to remind her of this fact, saying, "You were born on a very evil day, Anne." She became the subject of a sensational court case in which she alleged that her mother had sterilized her without her knowledge to deprive her of the family money. When her dad died in 1921, he left 2/3 of his estate to her, Anne, and 1/3 to her mother, his wife. But the will stipulated that Anne's share reverted back to her mother if she died childless. So Anne filed a civil lawsuit against her mother in 1936 for $500,000. This was in San Francisco. Prosecutors in that city then followed with criminal charges with her mother and the 2 doctors who had performed the surgery. So let's back up for a minute. Who were Anne's parents? Well, Anne's father was Peter Cooper Hewitt, an inventor and the grandson of Peter Cooper, one of the patriarchs of New York. Peter Cooper, the grandfather, was behind a slew of inventions in the 19th century, including the Tom Thumb, which was a steam locomotive. He also patented gelatin, or Jell-O. He was involved with the laying of the first transatlantic cables, which made it possible for Americans to communicate by telegraph with Europe. So there was quite a lot of money in this family. Peter Cooper Hewitt, Anne's father, inherited millions, which he then supplemented with his own invention, the mercury vapor lamp. This lamp was popularly used in industrial settings because it was economical with its use of energy, but it gave off a very ghastly reddish hue, which would have made it unsuitable for homes or private spaces. Marion Cooper Hewitt was a socialite with rather mysterious origins. She came to New York from California in 1902. She floated in the upper echelons of society and had a reputation for trading in her husbands. When she met Peter, he was already married, and she had been twice married and divorced, but they had an affair. Anne was conceived in Paris, where Marion was living large. She loved to gamble and party at the high-end resorts. And 3 years after Anne's birth, Peter did divorce his wife for Marion. The three of them lived briefly in Paris. He then got sick with abdominal problems and died in 1921. Anne was 7 years old. The circumstances of his death were a little suspicious. Some believed that Marion may have helped to hurry things along. A nurse, for instance, claimed that she'd seen Marion give him a potion. She believed this was because Marion already had her next husband lined up. And indeed, not long after Peter's death, Marion married a baron. This was her fourth husband. They divorced. She married again and divorced that man. So by the time Anne's court case came along, Marion had been married and divorced, married 5 times, divorced 4 times. Her one husband, Anne's father, had died. So she resumed his name, Marion Cooper Hewitt. So back to 1936. After Anne filed her civil complaint, she held a press conference in San Francisco. Here she told the world what her mother had done. She claimed that her mother never liked her, referring to her as an ugly duckling and an imbecile. One day, the two of them were dining at a resort in California when Anne was suddenly struck with stomach pains. Their chauffeur raced them back to the city, San Francisco, where a doctor was waiting. And he said, "Well, Anne, I understand you have appendicitis." Then she was taken to a room where a psychologist was waiting. This woman asked what were essentially civics questions. Why did the Pilgrims come to America? What is the longest river in the United States? When was the Battle of Hastings fought? Anne was scheduled to have her appendix removed 4 days later. She came back to the hospital on that date and underwent surgery. Afterward, she heard the nurses talking about her as a, quote, idiot patient, and she realized with horror what her mother had done. So the public hears this story and they're totally aghast. And people wonder how it was that a woman who appeared as intelligent and well-spoken as Anne did could be operated upon. And they also wondered how common these forced sterilizations were. What happened behind the walls of an asylum didn't really make for polite conversation. So people were unaware about the statistics, how common this was, and who it was happening to. And so the public was immediately hooked by the case. Many remembered Marion from the society pages a few decades before when she'd been on the party circuit in New York. After Anne filed her case, and then the prosecutors in the city filed criminal charges, Marion fled for the East Coast. This socialite was not about to be arrested. Once there in New Jersey, she arranged for an attorney to file a response to Anne's civil suit. Via affidavit, she claimed that Anne was absolutely a moron. She'd always had trouble in school, and she was unruly. Marion had to hire one governess after another because Anne was so ornery. Marion claimed that Anne was addicted to masturbation and had been since 3 years of age. She claimed that Anne was a flirt and she especially liked men in uniform, meaning working class men. She once tried to run off with the chauffeur, and Marion found letters that Anne had written to the chauffeur, which contained her pubic hair. And according to Marion, Anne had also once had to be pulled off the lap of an African-American porter on a train. So notice here how Marion is making her case. She appeals to fears of miscegenation or race mixing. She claims essentially that Anne is going to cross the color line. That's what's so dangerous about her being promiscuous, is that she might mix with other races. Notice also how she conflates mental illness with sexual deviance. Anne is a moron because she's a wayward girl. She's a wayward girl because she's a moron. And Marion was actually not making this logic up. It was the logic of the eugenics movement, which had really reached its height in the 1920s in America and was beginning to wane in the 1930s when this case came along. And eugenics was essentially a movement to protect the white race. The term eugenics means well-born. It was coined by Sir Francis Galton on the left, who was a British intellectual from the 19th century and a relative of Charles Darwin. Galton was very disturbed by what he perceived to be the increase of criminality, poverty, disability, and other unwanted traits. He suggested that society could curb these problems, the degeneration of the race, as he saw it, by getting the right people to reproduce. So this is now called positive eugenics, getting the right people to reproduce. Galton himself came from a noble family, and he thought if there could just be more of his kind, then society could eradicate a lot of social ills from the world. So importantly, he believed that criminality and alcoholism and other unwanted traits were inherited, just like brown eyes or brown hair or blue eyes. So you can see how Marion would say that Anne was born defective. She was born sexually promiscuous. These weren't things that she was socialized to be. She just always was that way. Galton's work was taken up in the US in the early 20th century by a man named Charles Davenport. He's the figure on the right. Davenport also wanted to build a better society, but he wanted to focus on the other side of the eugenics coin, stopping the unfit from reproducing. He opened the Eugenics Record Office in 1910 in New Jersey, which hired field workers to go out and interview the public and get their family trees. Davenport also urged the need for immigration restrictions. He was motivated by the demographic changes he saw in America. There was a heavy influx of immigrants from Eastern European countries, and there was a movement of African Americans from the South to northern cities, what we call now the Great Migration. Many of these African Americans were trying to flee Jim Crow society, where lynching was very common. But the Northerners didn't all want these people. They liked their white, well-born population. Davenport was also influenced by the rise of poverty in the industrial age. People like him were beginning to see slums in New York and Chicago and Philadelphia that had never been there before. And he, like Galton, didn't see poverty as stemming from greed or widening disparities between the rich and the poor, but rather from hereditary defect. Most of the sterilizations that took place in the first few decades of the 20th century were on Eastern European immigrants who weren't looked at as being the right kind of whites, the poor, the disabled. And the goal was to really shore up the white race by purging it of its weakest members. That way it would remain virile and be able to stay on top. This was the logic of eugenics. The white public was largely on board with this project of engineering the perfect race, even if people didn't quite realize how many people were being sterilized, what was really happening behind those walls of the asylum. At state fairs, eugenicists hosted fitter families contests in which they awarded ribbons and medals to people with creamy skin, blue eyes, a nicely arched nose. There were also Better Babies contests, which honored healthy-looking white babies. Many Christian preachers participated in sermon contests in which they hailed eugenics as a religious duty. These figures believed that the sooner social ills could be eradicated, the sooner Jesus would return to earth. What's important to understand here is how widely eugenics, if not sterilization, appealed to people. So pictured on the left is Margaret Sanger, the founder of the organization to become known as Planned Parenthood. Sanger promoted birth control, not abortion, as is commonly claimed. She promised that birth control would help to eliminate the unwanted from society. However, there was a lot of daylight between her and people like Davenport. She saw disease, criminality, disability as stemming from unwantedness. So, for instance, if a woman was stuck in an abusive marriage and she became pregnant from rape, that child was prone to be defective, which was actually a common belief. It's not one that she invented, as ludicrous as it sounds today. So, in other words, she did not believe the problem was genetic. And it was because she thought this that she advocated for birth control for all women, including middle and upper class white women. And this angered eugenicists because in their minds, those were exactly the type of women who should be reproducing. In the middle is the evangelist Billy Sunday, who talked a lot about good breeding in his own sermons, which were delivered to stadiums with tens of thousands of people. Billy was also concerned about European influence. He wanted America to stay American. And to the right is President Theodore Roosevelt, who referred to the declining birth rate among Native white women as race suicide. By the 1930s, tens of thousands of people had been sterilized. The Supreme Court declared this constitutional. This was in the Buck v. Bell case involving Carrie Buck, who's pictured here on the left. She was an impoverished woman in rural Virginia who conceived a baby out of wedlock. Authorities used this fact, her out-of-wedlock pregnancy, to claim that she, just like her mother, was promiscuous. Buck claimed to have been raped. After she was sent to an epileptic colony and sterilized against her will, a lawyer representing her sued the medical authorities, acting on behalf of the state. And he was actually collaborating with the defense in order to test the legality of the new legislation. They were looking for a case to take all the way up to the Supreme Court to really enshrine the right to forcibly sterilize people. And in 1927, the case did go all the way up, and the Supreme Court upheld the ruling of the Virginia courts. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously opined, "It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for some crime, or to let them starve for imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." But by the time that Anne Cooper Hewitt's case came along in 1936, the science behind eugenics was proving to be rather shoddy. And in her chapter on the case, Wendy Klein explains that both genetic researchers and biologists were beginning to realize that the inheritance of positive or negative traits extended well beyond one generation. One prominent biologist at Johns Hopkins noted that even if all the, quote, feeble-minded people in the country were sterilized, it could take 6 to 8 generations to decrease the proportion of those traits in the population. And this was largely because normal people could be carriers of traits. Others elaborated on this criticism, claiming that it was impossible to identify potential carriers of bad genes and that eugenicists had completely disregarded the role of environment in the development of traits. The rise of the Nazi Party in Europe delivered another blow to the movement. In 1933, the Nazis implemented a eugenic sterilization program that impacted more than 350,000 individuals. This was partly inspired by the goings-on in America. I'll say more about that in a moment. As Americans learned about the persecution of Jews, they bristled at terms like racial betterment. So this language and the rhetoric that people like Charles Davenport and Theodore Roosevelt had used were beginning to unnerve the public because of what was going on in Europe. This meant that eugenicists in America needed to find a new idiom with which to describe the work of their movement. Could the Cooper-Hewitt case provide that idiom? Well, a man named Paul Popenoe certainly thought so. Popenoe was a Californian who had helped to found the Human Betterment Foundation in Pasadena, which was a eugenics institute. He had also begun the Journal of Heredity, which advocated for sterilization. He corresponded with authorities in several other states and even leaders of the Third Reich who thanked him for his work and claimed to be very much inspired by it. And Popenoe believed that Anne's case could help to shift the conversation away from genetics and the shoddy science, which is beginning to be exposed, and refocus on motherhood. He thought even if the public couldn't get on board with, say, sterilizing entire classes of people like epileptics or alcoholics or this whole group of people, that they would be able to appreciate the need for surgery in cases like Anne's. So Popenoe began to correspond with the defense attorneys who were representing the two doctors. He advised them not to dispute that Anne's mother was a terrible person and a terrible mother, but only to focus on whether or not Anne would make a good mother. So in other words, it didn't matter how someone acquired their unfitness for parenthood. All that matters was that she was unfit. And society had a responsibility to see that these kinds of people did not have children. Popenoe further believed that sterilization in private practice, like had happened in Anne's case, she hadn't gone to an asylum or a state hospital, but she'd gone to her own doctor, was going to constitute the next phase of the eugenics movement. And again, this too had to do with the transition away from sterilizing entire classes or groups of people, but going forward on a case-by-case basis. So it was okay for doctors to operate if they were confronted with someone like Anne, who was such a danger to society. And basically what Popenoe was trying to do was to modernize eugenics, to make it palatable for people who were unnerved by what was happening in Europe. So the case against the two doctors went to trial in August of 1936. You can read more about the outcome of that trial in the book. Anne and her mother's relationship was also transformed. More on that in the book too. I don't want to give everything away. Anne died then in the 1950s of abdominal cancer. After her trial, she had her own checkered personal life, married 5 times. So a lot of people said that the apple didn't fall far from the tree. After this, sterilizations did continue, both in California and around the nation. Indeed, as Popenoe predicted, surgeries moved to private settings. Also, women of color supplanted white women as the primary targets of forced sterilization. In Los Angeles in the 1970s, Mexican American women reported that they were being sterilized without their consent at a hospital there. The case, Madrigal v. Quilligan, brought attention to eugenics, just as Anne's case had done nearly 4 decades before. Pictured here is the attorney who represented the women, Antonia Hernandez. The plaintiffs lost that case, but they did succeed in gaining the attention of policymakers. So this is a picture of activists marching, responsive to the Madrigal case. And it caught the attention of a lawmaker in California who worked to finally formally repeal the laws that authorized sterilization in that state. And since that time, many other states have also followed suit in repealing their forced sterilization statutes. But the practice has continued. In 2013, a state audit found that between 2006 and 2010, 144 women in the California prison system underwent a bilateral tubal ligation under conditions of missing or dubious consent. Targeted inmates tended to share a profile. They typically tested below a high school reading level, had been pregnant multiple times, and were between 26 and 40 years of age. In 2020, news broke of forced sterilizations in ICE facilities. President Biden has closed at least 2 facilities where these occurred, but they are believed to be occurring under the radar in many facilities. Amnesty International is investigating. And what happened to positive eugenics, the effort to get the right women to reproduce? Well, that continued as well, especially because of Paul Popenoe, who's pictured here. He was the eugenicist who advised the defense in Anne's case. After becoming involved in that case, he decided to devote himself to a new institute he'd opened, the American Institute of Family Relations, which focused on encouraging marriage and reproduction among able-bodied middle-class white women. Popenoe counseled white couples on the importance of strict gender norms and same-race marriage. He didn't want whites to be marrying people outside their race. He discouraged women from having a career because it meant fewer children. He believed that they should stay home, keep the house clean, and be supportive of their husbands. He hired Dr. Arnold Kegel, who invented Kegel exercises. Popenoe urged women that they should do these Kegel exercises while they were vacuuming. He wrote, that way, when their spouses came home, the house would be sparkling and they'd be primed for intimacy. Those are his words. He trained many psychologists, clergymen, and youth group leaders to do the same kind of counseling. One person was James Dobson, who's now famous for founding the evangelical organization Focus on the Family. I knew him very well growing up. Dobson worked for many years as Popenoe's assistant, which is a detail that's conspicuously missing from Dale Buss's authorized biography of Dobson. As the eugenicist assistant, he authored numerous publications on male-female differences, the dangers of feminism, topics like that. He viewed homosexuality and feminism as grave threats to the family, seeming to rate crises like domestic abuse much lower. And when he founded Focus on the Family after working with Popenoe, he essentially baptized eugenics. So he suddenly claimed a biblical basis for this program, which he had learned from Popenoe, who was himself an atheist. So his extensive output for mostly white audiences expressed anxiety about interracial marriages and about non-white reproductive trends. So whereas Popenoe had advised marrying your own, focus on the family, discouraged crossing the color line, even though they claimed concerns about compatibility, and whereas Popenoe had fretted about the prolific reproduction of the lower classes, focused on the family, devoted a lot of attention in the 90s, in the early 2000s, to Black welfare dependency and out-of-wedlock births. In 2019, at the Trump administration's invitation, Dobson visited the southern border and afterward wrote about his fears that, quote, an illiterate, unhealthy, violent criminals would bankrupt and take down America if not controlled. So to be fair to Dobson, he was not the only person in the 90s to be worried about race suicide. Ben Wattenberg wrote a book called The Birth Dearth, which claimed that Native women weren't having enough babies to keep pace with people in non-Western countries. That book inspired many politicians and leaders, including Pat Robertson, Pat Buchanan, and Vice President Dan Quayle. These three even used that slogan, birth dearth, in their campaign and speeches and writing. And after I published an article on Dobson and these men tracing some of this history, I received a deluge of emails from people who claimed to have heard similar rhetoric in the context of abortion. So one evangelical man told me that his parents had said on repeat, the Muslims are having so many babies, it breaks God's heart that abortion is legal. So this white replacement rhetoric was on display at the 2021 March for Life. Members of the Patriot Front group, a white supremacist organization, carried signs reading "Strong families make strong nations," which is exactly the language used by Popenoe and his allies. Fortunately, many others at that march called them out for this rhetoric and condemned it. Tucker Carlson is often accused of pushing the, quote, great replacement theory, which is essentially that Democrats are trying to make America brown. They're letting in all these criminals and rapists, and before long, whites are going to be the underclass in many ways, according to Tucker. They already are the underclass. On the left, eugenicist language tends to come from policymakers in the health fields. Pictured here is Ezekiel Emanuel, a physician who was reportedly considered for Biden's cabinet. He has argued that elderly people don't really contribute to society, and therefore they don't deserve societal supports. This is exactly the kind of thinking of Francis Galton and Charles Davenport, who thought poor, disabled, immigrant, and otherwise unwanted people needed to be purged. I haven't closely followed the headlines, but I know that the same debate is beginning to be framed in Canada surrounding medical assistance in dying. Disability advocates are concerned that the state there, the government, should not be in the business of putting people to death because their state, like ours, has tended to think about life in terms of financial burden. So this project left me with many questions. Who in society's mind is deserving of public resources and who is not? Who decides who is deserving and who's not? How does the state continue to support or engineer the quote unquote right families and punish the wrong ones? And how do white women or people more broadly suffer from policies that are intended to hurt others? Jonathan Metzl, who is a psychiatrist, has coined the term dying of whiteness to describe this phenomenon, how whites so often become collateral damage of programs that are supposed to benefit them. And this question comes from thinking about how someone as privileged as Anne Cooper Hewitt could find herself in the crosshairs of this racist movement. And why don't we white women talk about the ways that we too sometimes die of whiteness? So that brings me to my next book, Girls and Their Monsters, The Janane Quadruplets and the Making of Madness in America, which will be released in a few months. Janane is a pseudonym for the Morlock Quadruplets, a set of identical girls born in 1930 in Lansing, Michigan, who were all diagnosed with schizophrenia. The Janane sisters were a media sensation from the day they were born. The public was deeply fascinated by them. By 6, they had a singing and dancing act. They often sang patriotic and religious tunes, for instance, about Christopher Columbus. Some of their songs contained racial slurs. They also opened for minstrel performers or men in blackface, their cuteness serving in stark contrast to the buffoonish men imitating the African Americans of the South. And upon learning these details, it swiftly became clear to me that these girls were being exploited to tell a story about America that whitewashed its history. These girls were also being exploited, much like those children in the Fitter Families contest that I mentioned previously, to showcase the ideal American: blonde, attractive, white, well-behaved, patriotic. The question was, did society's adoration for these girls translate into real regard for their well-being, or was it purely a symbolic investment? In other words, were the townsfolk only interested in what these girls represented? As the quads got older and the U.S. entered World War II, the local newspapers would write puff pieces about them, quote, doing their bit for Uncle Sam, such as purchasing war stamps, conserving food, participating in scrap metal drives. The story was that they were fighters of fascism. Was this the real story? Well, behind closed doors, they were being abused by their parents, especially their father. He'd long been ashamed of the fact that they were multiples because he thought it to be a sign of low breeding. He was a German immigrant, and his mother had told him to only marry German because, in her mind, other immigrants were responsible for America's problems. And he had married a Scottish-Irish woman, the mother of the quadruplets, and when she had multiples, he was deeply ashamed. When the quads were first born, the first words out of his mouth were, "What will they think my wife is? A bitch dog." The doctor who delivered the girls was also shocked, saying, "Aren't you a white woman?" So again, we have this idea that people of color are hyperbreeders. They're animalistic. This is the legacy of eugenics. In 1954, all 4 were diagnosed as schizophrenic. They were sent to the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda, Maryland, where they were studied by over 30 experts over the course of 3 years. They then returned for follow-up studies. The lead researcher, a psychologist named David Rosenthal, wrote a book on them in 1963. And that book essentially theorized that their case showed the influence of both genetics and environment. He said that they'd inherited some disposition to mental illness and then been subjected to this pathogenic home life. So it was both nature and nurture in Rosenthal's mind. Over time, their story of abuse dropped out of focus, and researchers were only concerned about genetics and the brain. So when the sisters returned for follow-ups in the 1980s, and especially the 1990s, the tests were almost entirely neuropsychological. The investigators didn't probe about what was going on in their lives, and it turned out that they were keeping secrets. I have learned about this by interviewing the surviving quadruplet and her son, who are pictured here. They both hold such a special place in my heart. And the book is based on extensive conversation with her over hundreds of hours, along with archival research, medical records from NIH, diaries, private letters, you name it. So please, if this book strikes your interests, consider pre-ordering or asking your library to order. Pre-orders are very helpful for new authors such as myself. It's available on the usual outlets. And I, again, thank the organizers for the chance to talk about both stories, and I look forward to your questions.
So, do we have any questions? Kim, are you going to be able to roll them across the bottom? In the meantime, so I'm taking note about, and I'm reading here too on a website. I'll mention the name of the website too. It's Michigan Institute for Healthcare Policy and Innovation, and it's got a little article on eugenics, and it mentions the California sterilizations that you had mentioned in the California prisons. And it came up with, now I got to scroll back to it. Hang on. I think it said 1,400 between a larger span of time in the California prison system. But it's also noting that it's still going on in other countries. So I'm sure there's cases in the US that are still happening, but what other countries are known for this practice? Do you know?
I don't know which ones, but I would venture to say nearly all. I know that in the US, another popular use of eugenics is with plea deals. Sometimes judges will offer a deal in exchange for getting that implant device that's like a birth control device. Some of them have been called out in the newspapers for it, but I imagine that it goes on a lot and we never hear about it. I have also read, and I believe that many disabled women continue to be pressured to be sterilized, often after they give birth. Sometimes women are sterilized after birth without their knowledge. So I believe that the practice, it still happens, but it tends to happen to populations who are already vulnerable and whose voices and experiences aren't often centered. The disabled, the poor, people of color, and much of society continues to turn a blind eye, or people are genuinely ignorant about it.
Do you know anything about what Native American women may have gone through?
Yes, and I talk about that in the book. There was a lot of forced sterilizations that had happened on reservations, and that was enabled by the fact that laws were passed over the years that essentially forbade the kind of medicine that Indigenous people practiced. So on these, there would be a Native reservation and they would have a hospital, but it would be staffed by Western doctors with Western medicine. And when they were forced to get care at many of these facilities, rather than the kind of care that was indigenous to their culture, they were more at risk of medical abuse, including sterilization.
So are you aware of any eugenics forced sterilization of men?
Yeah. So, the eugenics movement sterilized a lot of men. I didn't focus on them as much in this book because Anne's particular story had a lot to do with sexual promiscuity and the ideas of society around the, quote, oversexed woman. But men were sterilized in asylums just as women were, and they were often sterilized in criminal settings. So if they were incarcerated, usually with women, women like Anne, usually not in her social class, but, poor women were sent to an asylum and sterilized there. But in the case of men, often it's that they were incarcerated, they were jailed, and it happened in those kind of prison settings.
So I'm seeing here that the forced sterilization continues in, it looks like, Romania and the Czech Republic, maybe northern China, and that's from that report I'm reading. Anyway, it's a scary thought.
Absolutely.
I'm fascinated. I read the book months and months ago, and I was just riveted by it, and I can't wait to read your new book coming out. You've already got some great reviews on your new book, and I wish you lots of luck with that one. I can't wait to read it. We'll make sure we get it on order here at our library.
Thank you.
We have a lot of your books, the Unfit Heiress, in our system. So there are many copies that are either, well, there's some checked out and there's some that are available. So if anybody is interested in following up to read that book, are there any questions from our audience? Kim says, can you tell us about your research process?
Well, my process, it's a little different for the two books. So I guess I'll talk about the most recent one since it's the freshest in my mind. I learned about the quadruplets case from David Rosenthal's book, which was a 600-page book. So I read that, and then I began to just fill in the gaps by reading more about 1930s Michigan. And then maybe I'll find something in a book that strikes my interest and go read more about that. So I'm just kind of going down rabbit holes in the beginning and just feeling around for the story. But in this case, one of the quadruplets was such an integral part. And so I was just having conversations with her daily, testing different ideas and things out on her. And I continue to talk to her almost daily. But I'm also somebody that needs to be writing. I can't research and outline the whole thing and not put pen to page. So I'm kind of writing the story even before I know how it's going to end up, which of course means that I do have to do some rewriting. But I do believe that writing gets you there. Even if it helps you to figure out what you're trying to say and what the story is. Thank you for that question.
So when in your book, The Unfit Heiress, there's a lot of case law in the beginning, and then you've got the story in the center, and you've got a lot of case law in the end. What was it that sparked you on this subject matter to begin with? Do you remember a moment that was just like, I got to look into this more?
Yeah, well, there were a cluster of factors, but primarily it was that my daughter had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and I was researching about the history of that disease. That used to be deadly. Only 100 years ago did they discover insulin. And many people were upset about the discovery of insulin because they thought all these children are now going to live and then they're going to reach reproductive age and pass on their defects. And it just blew my mind that people could be upset about the discovery of a life-saving medicine for people with the disease that my child had. And it really made me realize that I didn't know anything about the eugenics movement. It certainly wasn't taught to me in any public schools. I had one college professor that discussed it, and I just couldn't believe that this whole thing had happened in our nation's history, and I didn't know about it. So, that really spurred me to want to write this book.
There's a lot of research now on neurological diversity and how people with either on the autism spectrum or with dyslexia have different skill sets that add to the workforce. And it's interesting to think that there would have been a time where purging that population would have been a purposeful choice to better humanity. And now they're looking at that diversity and thinking, maybe this is something that we've always had and has worked well in the workforce. People with dyslexia are known to be different types of problem solvers, and they even have that on LinkedIn now, dyslexic problem solving skills.
Oh, wow.
So it's just fascinating to me that we would have thought to decide that these people shouldn't have children.
Yeah. And I think that in the case of mental illness and neurological diversity, which back then wasn't segmented, they didn't really understand the difference. Those conditions were so closely tied to ideas of moral deficiency. So if you were mentally ill, you were assumed to be morally deficient, and vice versa. Epileptics were thought to be possessed. There was the word demon shakes. And so they truly viewed those people as not just being bodily defective, but morally defective. So fortunately, many people today don't, assign any moral categories to disability. Well, some disabilities. I would say there's still a lot of diseases, including diabetes, where they do pass moral judgment. Diabetes continues to be a disease that people think is acquired by poor choices, by being lazy, being gluttonous.
I hesitate to bring this up. Maybe somebody who's watching remember, but there's another book that came out this year, or it might have been 2022, about eugenics and the history of a couple of African American sisters who were sterilized. I'm picturing it, but I cannot think of the name of it. If anybody out there remembers the name of it, please post it up there.
Was it the Ralph sisters?
Not sure.
Okay.
And there was an African American nurse who was actually working with those girls at the time, and she didn't realize that they were trying to get them sterilized. It happened without her knowing that, and she was trying to provide some oversight and some care for them.
And was this decades ago or recently?
It was like the 1960s.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So anyway.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that if you think of it.
I'll have to let you know. I'll send you an email.
Thanks.
That was a phenomenal book that came out recently too. So anyway, all right. If we have a few more minutes here, I want to just thank everybody who's tuned in to us and has watched this. I want to also thank anybody who's watching this recorded presentation. We have a lot of people now that are tuning in to recorded presentations. And I'd let you know that the Ditch Lilies with Carrie Larson and Lisa Schultz will be here playing music at the library on Saturday, March 25th in this at noon in the main area of the library. So not the lower level, the main area of the library is the way I understand it. there may be a change there, but that's the way I understand it. And then to remind everybody to check our website and our website calendar for events coming up in April. We do have a lot of events happening in April too. And as we're getting ready for the summer library program, we've got a lot of fun things going on. The library is going to be celebrating its 100 years in existence, not the building. Our building is only like 25 years old, 26 years old. But 100 years ago, in May or June of 1923, there was a decision to make a public library in River Falls. So we'll be celebrating that this summer. And I look forward to seeing everybody here. So thank you very much, Audrey, for making us smarter today. And I loved your book, and I can't wait to read your next one.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.